everybody, today we're doing the verse riff from Ramble On. Objectively one of the coolest bass lines ever written. Let's get to it. Before we actually get into the riff, I want to outline 3 techniques you're going to need to know in order to play the riff. The first technique is muting with your ring finger on your right hand. This is likely to be a new concept for a lot of you. It's going to feel awkward at first, but trust me, it's so worth getting this technique down because it comes in handy all the time. We're going to use that a couple times in this riff. The first time is right after the first note. So we're going to be on the 7th fret of the A string. We're going to play that with our index finger on our right hand. And then we're going to mute that note with our ring finger. So just practice those 2 things over and over again. Note, mute. Note, mute. With repetition, it'll start to feel comfortable. The other spot that we're going to use that in the riff is a couple notes later on the 7th fret of the D string. This time though, we're playing that note with our middle finger. So you also want to practice it this way. Middle finger, mute with ring finger. Middle finger, mute with ring finger. The second technique we're going to talk about is ghost notes. A ghost note is just a purely percussive note that doesn't have any sustain. So you're just hearing the attack. The way that we're going to do the ghost notes here, there's a couple different ways you can do them, but in this riff, we're going to mute the string, whatever string we're hitting, with at least 2 fingers on our left hand. And by mute, I just mean touch the string. We're not pressing anything down because we don't want contact with the fret here. We're just touching the string so that it can't vibrate after we hit it with our right hand. The reason why you want to use multiple fingers is that if you only use one finger, you're likely to get a harmonic, which is not what we're going for. We're going to use that on the D string and the G string several times in this riff. The third technique is grace notes. The first grace note we're going to do in this riff is going to be on the 9th fret of the G string. We're going to be using our index finger, our first finger for that, and we're immediately going to hammer on to the 11th fret of the G string. So a grace note is a very short note that's immediately followed by another note. Usually that involves hammering on or sliding to another note. In this case, we're hammering on 2 frets higher. The second grace note is going to be followed by a slide, so you want to practice that one separately. That one's going to start on the 11th fret of the G string, and we're going to slide up to the 13th fret. It's the same concept though. You hit the string and then immediately slide up to the 13th fret. So that grace note is so short, you're not really hearing it sustain at all. It's just a starting point that immediately moves to the next note. Once you're comfortable with all 3 of those techniques, you're ready to jump into the riff. So we're starting out the riff on the 7th fret of the A string with our first finger, because the 7th fret is the lowest fret we're going to play in the riff, and we always assign our first finger to the lowest fret. So we're here, play that note, then immediately we have our first technique that we worked on, which is muting with our ring finger on our right hand. So first note, and then immediately mute that note with the ring finger. Then we have the second technique we worked on, which is the ghost note on the D string. We're going to play that with our middle finger on our right hand, and there's our ghost note. So, right? Note, mute, ghost note, and then 9th fret of the D, 7th fret of the D, followed by another ring finger mute, and then another ghost note, this time on the G string. So note, mute, ghost note, 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 mute, ghost note. And now you see I'm sliding my fingers up because this is our third technique that we worked on. That grace note, hammer on from the 9th fret to the 11th fret on the G string. Right, and then we go 9th fret, and then we rake with our right hand, 11th fret on the D string, and that is the end of the first half of the riff. And we just slide back down here to our starting point, and we start the second half in the same spot that we started the first half. So one more time through that first half. Note, mute, ghost note, 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 mute, ghost note, grace note, hammer on, 9th fret, 11th fret, slide. There's our first half of the riff. The second half starts in the same spot that the first half started, on the 7th fret of the A string, using the same fingers, and then also followed by a ring finger mute of that note. So note, mute, and here's where it starts to differ from the first half. The following note here is on the G string, but it's also a ghost note, just like we saw in the first half. So we're going to reach up with our middle finger here, and as we're sliding up here, muting the string as we're sliding, we're going to play that ghost note. And we're sliding because the next thing we do is the second version of the grace note that we practiced, which is sliding from the 11th fret of the G string to the 13th fret of the G string. All right, and then we have this walk down, which is kind of a series of note, rest, note, rest, note, rest. So we're playing a note, and then we're muting, then we're playing a note, and then we're muting several times in a row. So again, starting from the beginning of that second half, note, mute, ghost note, grace note, slide, and now we mute with our middle finger on our right hand, 11th fret, mute, 9th fret, mute, and now we're raking here with our index finger onto the 11th fret of the D string, muting with the middle finger, 9th fret of the D string, muting with the index finger, and then we have this quick series of notes to end the riff. 7th fret, 9th fret, slide up to the 11th fret, 9th fret of the G string, and then rake to the 11th fret of the D string, and then this half ends just like the first half ended, with a slide from this note back to our starting point. So that second half all together, note, mute, ghost note, grace note, mute, 11, mute, 9, mute, 11 of the D, mute, 9, mute, and then the cluster of notes, 7, 9, slide to 11, 9, 11, and then we're done. All right, we have the technique, and now it's time to add the rhythm, and this is where it's going to start to sound like the riff. So I'm going to walk you through the counting of this whole riff really slowly, and then we'll do it one more time at a little bit of faster pace. So here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and a 4 E and. So we're counting in all eighth notes up until that last little burst of 16th notes at the end of the riff, and then we add some E's and U's in there. So one more time, a little bit faster tempo. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and a 4 E and. All right, so let's pick this thing apart. The key that we're in is E major, and the chords that are being played by the guitar are 1 and 4, or E major and A major. The tempo of this song is 98 beats per minute. It is in straight feel, and this verse section has a very laid-back vibe thanks to the meandering bass line, the minimal percussion, acoustic guitar, and a pretty lazy vocal approach. So overall, it's a very chilled out section that really sets the stage perfectly for the drastic shift in energy that comes in the chorus, where things get much heavier and more aggressive. This riff spans about 1.5 octaves, so we're actually moving between a couple different scale patterns here. The first one that we spend most of our time in is what I call a first finger major scale pattern, and we're starting here on this E, which is a 7th fret of the A string. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. And then the second one is actually another first finger pattern, but we only play the first 3 notes of it. 1, 2, 3, and that's as high as we go. So together we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3. Using those scale patterns that we just laid out, we can see that when we go through the riff, we're using scale degrees 1, 5, 4, and then a quick hammer on from 1 to 2 up in this higher octave, back to 1, 6, and that's our first half, and then we're back here at 1, and then a quick slide from 2 to 3, back to 2, 1, 6, 5, and then this quick 4, 5, 6, 1, 6. And then of course we also want to know the names of the notes that we're playing in the riff, so let's go through that. We're starting on E, jumping up to B, A, and then a quick hammer on from E to F sharp, back to E, C sharp. That's our first half of the riff, and then we're back down here on E, and then a quick slide from F sharp up to G sharp, back to F sharp, E, C sharp, B, and then our quick series of A, B, C sharp, E, ending on C sharp. So this is where it gets really interesting when we start looking at the way that his note choices relate to the chords that are being played by Jimmy Page. We are starting out, like we said, scale degree 1, and this is being played under a 1 chord. So this is a root note of that 1 chord. And then he jumps up to a 5th of the 1 chord. And then we switch to a 4 chord, and he somewhat predictably goes to the root of that 4 chord, and then jumps up to the 5th of the 4 chord. So root 5th and then root 5th. But then immediately he does his hammer on up to the 6th of the 4 chord, back to the 5th, and then to the 3rd. So that's the first half, and so far he's really just kind of outlining the arpeggios, but he's doing it in a really interesting way when you factor in the rhythms that he's playing and the order of the chord tones that he's playing. So second half, back to our root note on the 1 chord, then he jumps up an octave plus to the 2nd of the 1 chord, slides up to the 3rd, and then does his walk down, 2nd, root. As he hits this root, we then change to a 4 chord. So he was on the root note of a 1 chord, now he's on the 5th of a 4 chord, 3rd of the 4 chord, 2nd, root of the 4 chord, and then we have that fast cluster of notes, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, ending on the 3rd. So the reason I find this so interesting is that this bass line is a great example of how to take a basic chord progression, 1 to 4, and write a bass line using mostly chord tones, right? So mostly arpeggio notes, roots, thirds, and fifths, and somehow arrive at something that is totally musical and unique and melodic and sounds nothing like a series of arpeggios. If you gave most people a 1-4 chord progression and asked them to write a bass line using mostly chord tones, most people would come up with something like. But John Paul Jones uses those same building blocks and arrives at something that is completely different and unique. And he does that by using a few different compositional techniques. First of all, he's mixing up the order of the chord tones that he's playing, right? He's not just playing root, third, fifth, root, third, fifth, root, third, fifth. Sometimes he goes root, fifth. Sometimes he goes root, third. Sometimes he starts a chord on a fifth or a third. He also is throwing in some non-chord tones like seconds and sixths. And that really goes a long way toward making the bass line sound less like a series of arpeggios and more like a melody. Third, and I think maybe most importantly, his rhythmic choices. He's not just playing a whole bunch of eighth notes or a whole bunch of quarter notes. He's using a variety of note values. He's arranging them in this really interesting and syncopated way. He's using lots of rests and tied notes, and overall creates these two distinctive phrases that play off of each other. Throughout this lesson, I've been referring to the first half of the riff and the second half of the riff, right? And that's because they really do function as two parts of a whole. So this bass line is just such an amazing example of how to take the raw materials of a pretty straightforward chord progression and build something extraordinary out of them.